Hi, this is Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and in this lesson we're going to learn how to configure Hyper-V. This maps to Objective 2.6 of the Microsoft 70-687 certification exam. The official objectives have 4 different sub-objectives. The first is create and configure virtual machines. We'll talk a little bit about what that means later. The next is to create and manage snapshots. Snapshots let you roll a computer back in time. It's pretty amazing. The third is to create and configure virtual switches. Virtual switches they're talking about network switches, basically like hubs which link multiple computers together. It's another component that can be completely virtualized in the virtual machine environment. The last sub-objective, create and configure virtual disks, which is exactly what it sounds like. Now, the first step in configuring Hyper-V and virtual machines is to create a virtual switch. So we'll start this demo out by installing Hyper-V and then creating a virtual switch. This is my Windows 8 PC. So our first step is going to be to install Hyper-V. Now, normally I wouldn't bother showing you how to install a simple component, but this is really well hidden. So I'm going to search for features here on the Start menu, spell it correctly, and then look in the settings. Now, this is confusing. You don't need to know this for the exam, but for your real life, you need to remember to look at Turn Windows Features On and Off. It's confusing because there's another feature called Add Features to Windows 8, and you don't want that one. You want Turn Windows Features On and Off. Now in this dialog box, you'll see a list of different features you can add, including Hyper-V, which is not installed by default. So select that and allow it to install the management tools as well. So while this is installing, I'll talk a little bit about what virtual machines are. A virtual machine is a computer inside your computer. It's a bit like Inception, right? The virtual machine environment allows you to make a fake computer that is in a walled environment. Nothing can come in or out of that virtual machine unless you go out of your way to do it. This gives you a lot of different benefits. I think everybody can use virtual machines for different reasons. If you are an individual power user, a virtual machine is a great way to test out a new app without taking any risk that the app will install some malware or screw up your computer. In the IT world, we use this not only for testing, but to work with different configurations in a lab environment without running a bunch of hardware. So if you want to know how Windows 8 and storage spaces work with a computer that has 10 different hard drives, well, you could go to the store and buy 10 hard drives and hook them all up to a computer. Or you could just make a virtual PC that has 10 virtual disks, and you'll get basically the same experience. Virtual machines also support snapshots, which allow you to go back in time. So you can take a snapshot, screw up the PC all you want, and then just go back to what the snapshot was as if nothing had ever happened. So I can see that Hyper-V has mostly installed itself, and I will go ahead and restart the computer now. So the reboot finished, it actually had to restart twice. I'll take a minute to mention that every other demo in this video series is recorded within a virtual machine. This is an exception. I am running this on a physical Windows 8 PC, and the reason is Hyper-V installation requirements. Hyper-V can't run within a virtual machine. Maybe they are afraid of some like overly nested Inception thing where you have virtual machines inside of virtual machines inside of virtual machines. Well, the truth is that Hyper-V, one of the requirements for installing Hyper-V is that the computer be capable of hardware-level virtualization. Now, hardware virtualization is a feature that almost every computer made in the last 3 or 4 years is going to support, and some older computers as well, but it's often not enabled by default. So go ahead and try to install Hyper-V. If it doesn't work, go into your computer's BIOS and look for a setting that indicates turning on virtualization. You'll find it's often turned off in the BIOS by default, and you just need to turn it on. If you don't see anything about virtualization in the BIOS, it could be your PC doesn't support virtualization. That means you won't be able to run Hyper-V. However, you might be able to run other virtual machine solutions such as Oracle's free VirtualBox software, which is actually what I use on a day-to-day basis. Now, for the exam, you need to know Hyper-V, so let's take a look at how to start that. From the Start screen, I will launch Hyper-V Manager. The virtual machine connection over here is for connecting to remote virtual machines that are running on a different computer on the network, kind of like Remote Desktop does. Now, the first step to creating a virtual machine is not to create a virtual machine. You first need to create a little bit of infrastructure, a virtual switch. So over here in the Actions column, I'm going to seek out the Virtual Switch Manager here and click that. Now you can see I'm prompted to create a virtual switch, and I get to pick from 3 different types of virtual switches. The external virtual switch is going to be the type of virtual switch you use for just day-to-day virtual machines. This gives them access to the external internet. So if you want your PC to be able to download some updates from Windows Update, well, it's probably going to need external internet access. Now, create an internal virtual switch. If you want your virtual machine to be able to talk to other virtual machines and the host PC, but not other computers on your LAN or computers on the internet. This prevents them from being able to easily install updates from the internet, but it greatly reduces the security risk because, say, this virtual machine couldn't get a malware infection and steal the secrets from other computers on your internal network and then post them on the internet. So it is more secure than an external network, but it can also be more of a pain because if you want to get updates to it, you would need to copy those updates to your host computer and then copy them to the internal computer. Now, the private virtual switch type allows it to communicate only with other virtual machines on the same computer. So it can't connect to any physical machine on your network, just other VMs that you connect to the exact same virtual network switch. So to provide internet access, we'll create a external virtual switch. And I'll just call it external. Now, in the connection type here, you get to choose where you're going to connect it. Now, I just chose external. If I decide to change my mind at this point, I could easily pick another option. This prompts you to select which network adapter you can use. You can see that this computer has 2 physical network adapters and then an Ethernet adapter for the alternative virtual machine solution, VirtualBox. It's a software network adapter, so it doesn't actually go anywhere. This is the wireless adapter, and this is the wired adapter. So I'm using the wired adapter right now, and I'll select that. This checkbox is pretty important. If you have a network adapter in your computer just for your virtual machines use, then you would clear that checkbox, and Hyper-V would dedicate that network adapter for the use of the virtual machines. Now, this might seem a bit odd because who has a desktop computer with multiple NICs in it, and especially one NIC just for virtual machines running in Hyper-V? This seems like a really odd scenario, doesn't it? Well, it is for desktop computers, but it's an extremely common scenario for servers. In server environments, it's very common for enterprises to run one big monster server, and then they'll run like 10 different instances of Windows Server 2012, say, within virtual machines within Hyper-V server. So this brings us to the origins of Hyper-V on the client. They didn't design the Hyper-V that you're seeing here for desktop use. Instead, they designed it for use in servers in enterprises, and then they kind of like hacked it around to work in the client. So we're going to see a lot of features that don't make any sense in desktop environments, and the reason is that they're just being carried over from server environments. So this is one of those features. I have never heard of anybody needing to clear that checkbox in a desktop environment, but that's what it does. It dedicates a physical network adapter in the event the server has multiple different network adapters, and the IT environment needs to control network traffic. But for the most part, in practice, you'll always leave that checkbox selected. Down here, this is another more server-oriented selection. VLAN identifiers, virtual LAN identification, is a number that's assigned to the network communications coming out of a computer, and it allows sophisticated network switches like those that enterprises would use to partition traffic for different computers. So what you could do here is you could have 10 virtual machines running on a server probably, and they would all be connected to a single network adapter, but the network switch could actually use VLAN identifiers to take the traffic from the different virtual machines and put them onto different local area networks, even though they're all using the same network adapter. Pretty cool, right? Again, not something you'll use a lot in the desktop environment, but if you ever work with Hyper-V Server, you should understand what that is. Now, of course, updating virtual switches requires it to make a change to the network adapter. So it's warning me about that, and I'll probably lose my connection here and have to reestablish it. Now, with the required virtual switch created, we're ready to do the fun stuff, which is making a virtual machine. Let's jump back to Windows 8. And this is the Hyper-V Manager. So to create a virtual machine, over here in the left pane, I'm going to select my computer here. You see you have the ability to connect to several different computers running Hyper-V. Again, this is a feature that's primarily useful in a server environment. You probably wouldn't connect to a virtual machine on the desktop computer of the guy next to you, but in an enterprise, they might have a dozen different servers, each running Hyper-V, and you could line them all up here in the Hyper-V Manager and browse the different servers. I'll right-click that, click New, and then click Virtual Machine. And this opens up the new Virtual Machine wizard. Here's your introduction. Let's get past that. And we'll give this a label. I'll set up a Windows XP computer. And you can see by default, it'll put it on your C drive under the Microsoft Windows Hyper-V folder. That's a pretty obscure folder because program data is hidden by default. That's okay if you want Hyper-V to manage the files for you. If not, if you want to be able to see the files yourself, they get really big. You can select that and select a different folder. Startup memory is really important. You need to understand first the minimum required by your guest OS. The guest OS is whatever operating system is going to be running within the virtual machine. I'm going to be running Windows XP, which doesn't require much memory at all. It'll get by with 512 megs just fine. But if you are running a 32-bit Windows 8 OS, do you recall how much you would require from an earlier lesson? 32-bit Windows 8 requires 1 gig of RAM, while 64-bit Windows 8 requires 2 gigs of RAM. So you'd have to enter 1024 for 1 gig of RAM or 2048 for 2 gigs of RAM. Now you'll see a checkbox here about dynamic memory. Dynamic memory is another feature that's primarily designed for server environments, but I will tell you what it does. Operating systems require more or less memory throughout their life cycle. When you start up Windows, it tends to need a lot of memory as it's getting different services started. Now, once they're started, they don't require quite as much memory. So it starts out requiring a bunch of memory, and then the amount of memory it needs goes down, and then maybe launch some big app, say SQL Server or a development environment, Photoshop, and it takes a bunch more memory. Now, if you have the dynamic memory checkbox here cleared, you need to specify as much memory as the computer will need throughout its entire life cycle. And that amount of memory is going to be dedicated to that virtual machine. That means that you can't use that memory for other apps on the computer. This particular computer has 4 gigs of RAM. So by carving out 512 megabytes of that, that's 512 megs less memory that I have for any other app or any other virtual machine. What dynamic memory does is it makes it a little bit more efficient, just a hair really. In a desktop environment, you probably would never notice it, but it does get to be more important in a server environment. During the life cycle of the virtual machine, when it requires less memory, dynamic memory reclaims that and allows you to use it for other apps on the same computer, the host machine that is. When a virtual machine requires more memory, dynamic memory will grab that more memory and allow it to benefit and get greater performance by using more memory. So generally, it's a good idea to leave dynamic memory on, even though, again, in desktop environments, it's not that important. So on the configured networking page here, we're going to select the virtual switch that we created. You can create multiple virtual switches, so you could have a virtual switch for the external network or the internal network or private networks, and you could even make, say, multiple different private networks if you wanted to connect different virtual machines together in groups. Okay, so here's an important page. Connect virtual hard disk. Just like the name sounds, virtual hard disk is a software disk that simulates a physical hard disk connected to our virtual PC. Virtual hard disk is important because it can get really, really big, and it might even fill up your drive. Now, you'll notice here that it has a size of 127 gigabytes by default. That's going to be the maximum amount of room that the virtual hard disk will consume. It's also the size that Hyper-V reports to the guest operating system. So if I put 127 gigs here, And when I fire up Windows XP, Windows XP will think it has a 127 gig hard drive. Check the default location here. Now, for performance reasons, you really want this on your fastest disk. On the other hand, this file could grow to be pretty big. So if you put it on your system disk, you run the risk of filling up the system disk on your computer. If you only have one drive, that's fine. Now, this particular computer for me is a laptop with an SSD drive. It's super, super fast, so I like to use that super fast drive for my virtual machines. You'll also notice that you have the option to use an existing virtual hard disk if you created a virtual hard disk within a different machine, or if you created it separately apart from the machine. And if you don't want to attach disk now, you have that option. Of course, you won't get very far without a hard disk to store some software, but you can start that process. Now, on the installation options page, you get to choose the source for the software that you're going to install. Now, if you select install an operating system later, that's exactly like building a computer and then not putting any software on it. You can power it up and it will just sit there and do nothing. It'll say, I need some software to do anything. So what you normally do is you'll select install an operating system from a boot CD/DVD-ROM. Now I'll click Browse here to select an ISO file, and you'll see that I already have a variety of different ISO files here. Now, an ISO file is basically a CD or DVD contained within a single file. I have a Microsoft TechNet subscription, which is terribly useful if you're an IT guy or you want to become an IT guy, because they, for a fee, let you download recent versions of Windows as well as tools like Microsoft Office. You can do it completely legally, and they give you product keys and everything. Now, you can't use all this software in a production environment, but it's great for testing like I'm doing now. So I use it all the time to keep up with the latest software and make sure I stay legal. So I'm going to select the Windows XP ISO here, and you can see from the rather long file name that it comes with Service Pack 3 installed and that it's a 32-bit operating system. Now, I have a couple of other options here. I could install it from a boot floppy disk, because you know how you're always installing Windows from boot floppies, right? All right, well, I haven't done that since the 90s, maybe earlier, but it's still an option. Now, here's an option that might be more useful in an enterprise environment, and it's install an operating system from a network-based installation server. Now, if you do deployment in an enterprise environment, you'll discover Windows deployment services, which are really, really useful for deploying hundreds or thousands of computers on a network. Basically, once you configure the server, you can just plug a new PC into the network and it will start up, find its deployment server, and then automatically install Windows. And an hour or two later, you've got a fully customized computer connected to your network with all your own apps and everything. So I don't have a network-based installation server. I'm just going to install it from the CD. But in environments where that's available, that can be really useful. And this page just summarizes our options. Okay, so under the virtual machines list here, you can see the Windows XP computer that I've just created. Let's go ahead and start it up, and we'll start the setup process just to see how that goes. I'll right-click it and then click Start. Now notice nothing happens here. If you've used other desktop virtual machine systems, usually when you start it up, you get a window that is the computer's monitor. That doesn't happen by default in Hyper-V, but it's no big deal. All you need to do is to right-click it and then click Connect. And this is going to launch a separate window with Windows XP running in it. All right, here we go. You can see Windows XP Professional Setup. This is a whole computer running in this window. It's really cool, isn't it? So you can see at the bottom here it says press Enter to continue. If you haven't run Windows XP Setup in a while, that's how it works. And I'll press F8 to agree. And here I'm just going to select the unpartitioned space. As I was discussing earlier, if you recall, I made a 127 gig disk. Well, it's 130,000 megabytes, but you can see that Windows XP here doesn't know it's running in a virtual machine. It sees the virtual disk that I created as a physical disk. So I've tricked this computer. It's kind of like the Matrix. Like it thinks it's living in a real hardware PC, but it's not. It's all a ruse. It's just this virtual machine that I created, and I can do anything I want to it, and it's all fake. Okay, so I'm not gonna force you to watch the entire Windows XP setup. I do want to show off a couple other features of virtual machines. You can see here the pause button. That just pauses it. It doesn't even know it stopped. It doesn't tell it, hey, we're gonna stop for a while. It doesn't have to save it into, say, a sleep mode or anything. The operating system is unaware. Hyper-V simply pauses everything that's going on. It takes away its processor time, so it just sits there quietly. This allows me to divert processing resources to something else. If I felt like the virtual machine was slowing my computer down or I didn't need it for a while, I could just pause it, and then when I'm ready, I could come back to it. You'll notice a couple other buttons here. Pressing this button, shutdown, simulates, pressing the red shutdown button here is exactly like pressing the power button physically on your computer. It will cause the computer to shut down. This button here will save the state of the virtual machine. What it does is it takes all the contents of the RAM and writes it to a file. It's like pausing the PC, except that you could close it, free up all the memory used by the virtual machine, even reboot your host computer. Then you could resume it exactly where you left off, and the computer, the virtual machine, wouldn't even know you'd done anything. Pretty remarkable, isn't it? And this turn off button here is like unplugging the computer. You could actually screw up the contents of the virtual machine just as you might screw up a computer if you unplugged it without powering it down safely. So I only recommend doing that if you're not going to be using the virtual machine or if it's just a test server and you don't care about it. So those are the most important components of creating a virtual machine. So we'll move on to the next demonstration. Now we're going to discuss using snapshots. Snapshots are a pretty remarkable feat. Imagine if you could just roll back time on your computer. If you've ever installed an app that you just hated, maybe it was malware, and you just wanted to go back in time a week and restore your computer exactly to that state, well, with virtual machines, that's entirely possible, and it's really only a couple of clicks away. So let's get that virtual machine powered up. We'll take a snapshot of it, then we'll mess it up a little bit, and we'll go back in time so I can show you how it works. So I finished the Windows XP setup without you to save some time. Now, before we take a snapshot, I want to show you how to install the integration services. From the Action menu here, select Insert Integration Services Setup Disk. You can do this from the Hyper-V Management tool too. The integration services install within the guest operating system. So basically, there are a set of drivers that will install within Windows XP, and they allow Hyper-V to communicate a little more deeply with the guest OS. This kind of starts to break down the matrix, right? Because before you install the integration services, Windows XP thinks it's running in a physical computer, but it's not. It's running in a virtual machine. What the integration services do is they tell Windows XP, hey, you're actually running in a virtual machine, and here are a few things you can do more efficiently. So the integration services, they make it easier to move your mouse in and out. They allow you to copy from your host operating system to your guest operating system, and a few other niceties. I always install the integration services in any virtual machines that I use. So they get installed basically exactly like putting a CD into the computer. So when you select that option from the menu, Hyper-V inserts a virtual CD containing the integration software, and in this case, Windows XP kindly ran it for me. One of the reasons not to run Windows XP is it'll just run whatever you put in there. So now with integration services working, you can see I can now control it with my mouse a little bit better. So to demonstrate snapshots, I'm going to change a setting on the computer and then restore it. Now, so many notifications in Windows XP, it's like a walk down a terrible memory lane, isn't it? So I'm going to change this desktop. We'll just go with a solid blue color. And tell you what, I will remove File and Settings Wizard from the list. So now we have two separate changes, and I'm going to leave this running and switch back to the Hyper-V Manager here. Now, all I need to do is to right-click Windows XP here, and then click Snapshot. Now in the Snapshots pane, you see that it shows Windows XP and Now. That is the most, this is the snapshot that I created a few seconds ago and now represents its current state. So I'm going to go in and make yet another snapshot. Let's change this desktop background to something different. How about a red screen? Ooh, that's ugly. Now back in the Hyper-V Manager, I will right-click again and click Snapshot once again. So what you can see is I now have two different snapshots, and then there's yet a third state of the computer, which is the current state, representing any changes I might have made since then. These snapshots allow me to go back in time to capture the computer in different states. So I'll change the desktop background once again. To yellow. And now what I'll do is I will restore this particular snapshot. That's as simple as right-clicking the snapshot and then clicking Apply. Now before I do that, I'll show you that you can rename snapshots just to make it easier. So I'll call this red backdrop, and I will call this blue backdrop. So let's restore the red backdrop. Now it warns you here that the current state is going to be lost. If you have anything on the computer that you don't want to throw away, you better take a new snapshot. That's why it provides you the option to take snapshot and apply. So I'll do that now. So it created yet another snapshot for me. Just so we can remember it, I'll call this yellow backdrop. So let's switch back to Windows XP here, and you can see without even shutting it down, I didn't even start and restart it, none of that. Live, it restored it to the earlier state. Now, for the sake of the example, all I did was change the color of the background. But you could have installed 100 apps, you could have had malware infections running rampant, bots, whatever, it would have all been gone in an instant. Completely gone. So for the sake of comparison, I'll apply the blue backdrop. And you can see that's gone, but we have the blue backdrop. Now, one more time, let's go back to the most recent state, which is the yellow backdrop. And we have the yellow backdrop. So I'm sure you can imagine lots of different uses for this. I also want to show you that you have the option to have multiple branches. So let's say I made some changes after I applied the red backdrop, maybe I installed a new app, and I want to go back here and do something in parallel. Now you can see that I restored the blue backdrop and there's a current state which is in a different branch. This is like some sort of Back to the Future time travel thing. I might be a movie buff. I'm making all these references to Inception and Back to the Future and The Matrix. So in this particular Back to the Future branch, we have the blue backdrop, but I'm going to apply, let's say, one of these pictures. Now, switching back here, I can now save a new snapshot. So as you can see, snapshots can actually branch off into multiple different histories, and you can restore any of these states. So let's say you needed to compare Microsoft Office versus OpenOffice. You could install a single virtual machine with, say, Windows 8 and take a snapshot of that clean installation. Then you could install OpenOffice and take a snapshot. You could restore the original snapshot and then install Microsoft Office and take a snapshot. At this point, you'd have snapshots with both OpenOffice and Microsoft Office, as well as an original snapshot of a computer that was completely clean. And you could switch between them at will. Now, when a new patch comes out for Microsoft Office, you could install it and make yet a separate snapshot of it. You'd have all these different machine states that you could switch instantly between. It's incredibly useful for testing software and different configurations. Now, when you're done with a snapshot and you no longer need it, you can right-click it and then click either delete snapshot or delete snapshot subtree. So I'll delete this whole subtree here. Each snapshot takes up some disk space. The way it works is Hyper-V records anything that changes after the snapshot was taken in a separate file. Then when you go to restore the snapshot, it has just the changes and it applies those to the virtual machine image. This means that you're not storing an entire separate copy of the computer, you're only storing the changes. So if you have a virtual machine that takes up 10 gigabytes of space and you make a snapshot and then install an app that takes up 1 gigabyte of space, you're going to be using about 1 gigabyte of space. You're not going to be using 10 gigabytes in 2 separate places. So snapshots are a really efficient way to store changes rather than having multiple virtual machines, each with their own configuration. Now that you know how the most important features of Hyper-V works, let's put it to use. I want you to imagine that your boss has a task for you. Your organization still runs Windows XP on some computers, but the users are complaining that the browser is out of date. Now, the latest version of Internet Explorer that runs in Windows XP is Internet Explorer 8, but an enterprise won't just roll out an update without testing it. After all, a new version of Internet Explorer could mean that important websites no longer work. So your boss needs you to install Windows XP and then install Internet Explorer 8 so that you can test your different corporate websites and make sure it works. There's a couple of catches though. Your Windows XP computers don't have standard configurations. They have 2 network adapters in them. One network adapter that connects to a private internal network and another one that connects to the internet. These Windows XP computers, because they ran out of disk space some time ago, also have 2 hard disks in them. And it's important when users download files using their browser that those files go to the second hard drive. So you need to make sure that a computer in that configuration will work properly and support downloading files to the alternate hard drive. So let's go into Hyper-V and set up a virtual machine for that configuration. Now I still have Windows XP running here, so I'm going to go ahead and shut that down. Now notice I just closed the window that disconnects me from the machine, but you can see from the status here that it continues to run. So closing it doesn't stop it by default as it does in many other virtual machine software. You need to right click it and then click shut down. Now save would write all the memory to the disk. Turn off would simply unplug it. Shut down sends an ACPI message to the computer. Basically, it's a hardware message telling the computer to shut down. You can see from the thumbnail here that Windows XP listened and shut itself down. Just like a physical computer, if you want to add hard drives and network adapters like we do, you have to turn the computer off first. After all, you wouldn't crack open a computer that was still plugged in. So it's shut off now. The first thing we'll do is we'll create that private network that we need. So I'll open up the Virtual Switch Manager, select Private, and create the virtual switch. I'm pretty clever, so I'm going to call it Private and click OK. Now we have 2 virtual switches. Let's edit the virtual machine settings now. This lists all the different hardware that the virtual machine has configured. You can see this first icon up here is Add Hardware. So I'm going to choose to add a network adapter. Now I need to connect it to a virtual switch. You can see over here I already had a network adapter connected to the external network. So to fulfill my boss's requirements, I just need to add a network adapter and connect it to the private network. See how great that is? Now, while I'm here, I'm going to show you this really cool feature, and it's called Enable Bandwidth Management. This is pretty useful. If you have a virtual machine and it's going to be doing something really bandwidth intensive, like streaming video, you can limit the amount of bandwidth that it uses by setting the maximum bandwidth value here. So if I set this to 1 megabit per second, that virtual machine won't ever be able to use more than 1 megabit per second. If you set it to 0, it'll use as much as it wants. Now, you can also specify the minimum bandwidth that's allocated to the computer, and that's only going to make a difference when multiple virtual machines are fighting for the amount of bandwidth on your computer. If you set the minimum bandwidth Hyper-V will guarantee that that virtual machine gets the amount of bandwidth that you specify. It doesn't send a message to your network equipment or your router or your ISP to make sure that virtual machine gets enough bandwidth. It's only the amount of bandwidth that's coming out of your host computer. This is the kind of thing that's really useful in a server environment, and in a desktop environment, not that useful, because how many virtual machines are going to be running on your desktop, and when are they going to be fighting for the bandwidth? Anyway, it's more of a server scenario, but like I said, Hyper-V is really all about the servers. Now, notice just then I got an error message when I tried to apply it with bandwidth management enabled. It didn't give me any useful error information, but I will say that Hyper-V in general in Windows 8 is a little bit flaky. Hyper-V on Windows Server 2012, rock solid, but again, it's mostly designed for the server environment. It works in a client environment. You need to know it for the test for the client environment, but it's a little flaky. And honestly, it causes some problems with the network adapters on some of my computers too, so I don't like to have it installed. It tends to make the overall computer, especially the network connections, a little flaky. Now, we also need to add another hard drive. So I will select the IDE controller here. Now, IDE is a rather old standard for hard drives. You can see that this particular virtual machine has 2 IDE controllers. That's just the default that Hyper-V sets up when you create a new virtual machine. One IDE controller has the DVD drive connected to it. This file is the file for the Hyper-V extensions. I'm going to select this first IDE controller that has the existing hard drive connected to it. Select hard drive here and click add. Now I have the opportunity to connect a new hard disk. You'll see here that if my host PC had another physical hard disk, I could connect the virtual machine directly to the physical disk. That would provide great performance. It's really fast, but again, this is more of a server scenario than a client scenario. So I'll click New to create a new virtual disk, and this is the new virtual hard disk wizard. It gives you some more options than you saw when we were creating the Hyper-V virtual machine. Here you get to choose between VHD and VHDX formats. VHD is simply an older standard. You can see that it's limited to files of up to 2 terabytes in size. That's probably enough for any desktop scenarios, but again, for server scenarios, the new format, VHDX, tends to work better. The only reason not to use VHDX is if you're creating a VHD file that you're going to use with other software that works with VHD files. Lots of software, including Windows 7, can communicate directly with VHD files, but might not be able to work with VHDX files. Here are 3 really important options to understand about virtual hard disks. The type of virtual hard disk. Now, the default when you create a virtual machine is to create a dynamically expanding virtual hard disk. That's why Hyper-V didn't ask me this question when I created the virtual machine in the first place. Dynamically expanding creates a file on your disk to represent the virtual disk, but that file starts out at about 0 bytes. As you start to write more and more data to the disk, it grows as big as it needs to. That can make it a little bit slow. After all, if you were to write suddenly a 1 gig file to the hard drive, the computer not only has to write that 1 gig file, but it needs to keep growing the virtual hard disk file. So you don't get the best performance. If you want a little bit better performance, you can go to the fixed size here. Now, if you create a 128 gig system drive for a virtual machine and you choose fixed size, you can guess what the host machine has to do. It has to create a 128 gigabyte virtual drive file on the computer. When you select fixed size, the maximum size of the drive is immediately allocated on the host computer. That means you won't ever suddenly run out of disk space because the file is guaranteed on the host computer's physical hard drive. It also means that the virtual drive file doesn't have to grow bigger as the guest operating system writes more data to it. So fixed size means you won't run out of disk space, and it gives you the best performance, about 15% faster than the dynamically expanding disk. However, it consumes all the disk space right away, and if you had 10 virtual machines on your computer, each with 128 gigabyte virtual drives, well, that would be consuming a lot of disk space, and frankly, there'd be a lot of wasted disk space because most of those virtual machines would probably have a lot of free space. I always choose dynamically expanding. In server scenarios, fixed size can be really useful. This last option down here, differencing, basically stores the changes from another virtual disk. This can be really useful. You could install Windows 8 in a virtual machine, install the clean updates. Then you could set that virtual hard drive aside and create a new virtual machine with a differencing drive. That differencing drive would only store the changes based on the original drive. When you use a differencing drive, you can make changes to a virtual hard disk without ever modifying that original virtual hard disk. So you could create a base Windows 8 installation. Then you could create 10 different virtual machines with differencing drives, each pointing to the original VHD. This would allow you to basically have 10 different Windows 8 instances, all using a single VHD. It's a much more efficient way to store multiple variations of a single computer. Now, this sounds really similar to snapshots, except with snapshots, you can only run one version of a virtual machine at a time. If you create multiple virtual machines using differencing drives, you can run them simultaneously. So I'm going to create a virtual expanding drive here. And I'll just call this second disk. Now I get to select the size of it. I'm going to make it 127 gigs, but again, it will only take up a few bytes on my drive because there's no data in it yet. Just as an aside, this option can be really useful. Copy the contents of the specified physical disk. If you have a physical computer, you can migrate it to a virtual machine. This is really cool. Imagine that you have an old Windows XP computer sitting there and you don't like it taking up desk space. Pull the hard disk out, connect it to your new PC, then use the new virtual hard disk wizard to copy that old computer's physical drive into a virtual hard disk. Then you can start up your virtual machine and it will be like your physical computer has been stored inside there. It's like capturing a physical computer and transporting it into your virtual world. Pretty amazing, isn't it? So now our computer has 2 network adapters and 2 hard drives. That's exactly what our boss specified. So let's fire up this Windows XP computer. Make the screen a little bit bigger. All right, so the boss asked us to install the latest version of Internet Explorer. So I'm going to fire up the original version of IE and then download IE8. All right, so now we have Internet Explorer installed in Windows XP. Before I go any further, I'm going to take a snapshot of the computer. And I call this IE8 installed. Now, my boss needs me to change a few configuration settings to comply with the company requirements. So I can do that. I'll turn off the favorites bar. Well, good. It seems to be working. Let's make sure that the network adapters are installed properly. I'm going to run Device Manager, shortcut dev-mgmt.msc, and then browse to network adapters. Okay, we can see 2 different network adapters here. We know one is connected externally and the internet connection is working, and the other we connected to a private network. So Internet Explorer had no problem dealing with the 2 network adapters. Let's also check out the disk drives here. We can see 2 different virtual hard drives, proving that they're both connected okay. Now, typically in any version of Windows, you need to go in and initialize a hard drive. So I've added that virtual drive. I'll go into the disk management here, and you can see it detected that the new drive was connected and launched the initialize and convert disk wizard. So it prompts me to go ahead and initialize it. Now this is the disk management console, which hasn't changed much, but before I can save my downloads to it, I need to partition that new drive. This is a pretty common scenario. You will create virtual drives in Hyper-V, and then within the guest OS, you have to go in and configure them. So now you can see Windows XP is formatting that drive, and when it's done, it's going to be the E drive. So within Internet Explorer, we'll go in and change the download location. Now, the way you change the default download folder in Internet Explorer 8 is just to save a file to that different folder. So I will select the E drive and just save a file there. And now for the sake of testing, I will try to save a file, and sure enough, it defaults to the new E drive. So I can report back to my boss that the test succeeded, that Internet Explorer 8 does seem to render things properly and works with our particular configuration of 2 hard drives and 2 network adapters. That would have been a fairly complex thing to do otherwise. Now, while I have this running, I want to show you the virtual hard drive files. So let's go in and look at the virtual machine settings. We can see that it's stored in users, public, documents. I will just copy that whole path to the clipboard and then open it in Explorer. All right, so I'll sort those by most recently used. These are our 2 system disks. Now you can see 4 different files here correlating to the 2 disks in our virtual machine. The system drive is Windows XP here, and though I allocated up to 128 gigs, it's actually consuming about 1.8 gigs on the disk. That's because it's a dynamically allocated disk rather than a fixed size disk. Now notice the file name is Windows XP. That's what I named it. You'll notice another file up here, a VHDX file. This was a VHDX file. This is a VHDX. This just keeps all the changes because I made a snapshot. So because I made a snapshot, every change I make has to be recorded both here and here. Slows things down a little bit, but allows me to restore that earlier state. The second disk, I also allocated 128 gigs to. You'll notice that it's only 4 megabytes. Now, even though Windows XP formatted the entire disk, Hyper-V is smart enough to know that it's just a format, and while it keeps Windows XP busy, it doesn't actually consume any of my virtual disk file. So Hyper-V recognizes a format and just says, okay, we're formatting, but it doesn't actually grow the file to the maximum size of the disk, even though data is coming at it. And because I have a snapshot, it's also recording changes to the second disk, hence this other file here. Now, if I were to make any changes to the Windows XP computer and I wanted to return it to this state with IE8 installed and a clean configuration, perhaps I install another application or I mess up the toolbars, all I have to do is to right-click it and then click Apply. And that immediately undoes all of my changes. This is Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and I hope you found the lesson both educational and enjoyable, and I'll see you next time.